This is my final project presentation for Vue.js web app with serverless backend. Vue.js is a progressive front-end framework for developing user interfaces, as you can clearly see, and it competes with React and Angular. When I first decided what project to pick, I really wanted React because that seems to be the most popular when you do searching. But I figured I wanted to check out Vue and see how it compares, see if it's competitive, and how easy it was. There were reviews that indicated that it might be easier for a newbie to come up to speed on. So I'm glad I picked it. It's been a good experience. I haven't done React or Angular yet, but I look forward to trying those too. Anyway, my project is a family calendar app that allows you to demonstrate the CRUD, create, read, update, delete. So I demoed that in my short presentation, and you can view that if you want to see a demo. So what is inside of my application? What's it comprised of? It has a front end and a back end component, and the project structure, which we'll look at in a slide or two, shows that. But basically, the front end is composed of Vue.js and related infrastructure. So in order to design or create a complete application, I use Router, Vue Router, Vuetify to bring in the UI components so I didn't have to design them from scratch. Axios so we could make the web calls. I also included Auth0 because I wanted authentication, and Vuex for state management. So we pass data around and not really track too much state, but it's used for those purposes. The back end, which is really the meat of what we're trying to accomplish here, is comprised of CloudFront, which is the Amazon's way of allowing you to have a entry point into your application. You can create a URL and have HTTPS secured web pages from it. S3 bucket, that's where we keep all the Vue.js static assets, the front end. API gateway, which is how we call the Lambda functions that we'll be using to get the data from DynamoDB. And so in this presentation, I'm not going to go over IAM roles, permissions, and policies. That's all documented in my project documentation. We're just going to kind of keep it high level here. And I also included at the end some optional information about CloudFormation, which is included in the project. The architecture, kind of what I was just describing. It's fronted with CloudFront. That's where I get my secure URL, public URL that I can share with people. It calls the index.html from the S3 bucket, which then calls API gateway whenever it needs to get information from the backend. So, and API gateway routes requests to Lambda functions, and I have create, read, update, delete, post, get, put, delete that access the DynamoDB. So let's talk about the backend structure. Let me actually get out of this for a second and show you how simple the project looks when you really shrink it down. The backend and front end are the main folders. Pretty simple. It looks really simple when you first open the project until you expand it. Oops. So let's go over the structure. I did build this using CloudFormation, so that's why this SAM file. But basically the structure is I have a folder for my events, and under that folder there's a folder for each HTTP method, so delete, get, post, and put. And then in each one of those folders is the Lambda function, along with packaging because this is a Node.js application. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I've also included my IAM permissions and policy files in this area. And the template.yaml and samconfig are related to CloudFormation, which makes it easy to deploy this instead of the manual way that I describe in my project documentation. So to get started with an actual Lambda example, this is it. I mean, this is the get events function. So a user would come into the app, and when they first land on the home page, after they log in, it makes a request to get events, and that goes into this Lambda. It calls this Lambda function, which basically we create a parameter object with it, which has a filter expression in it, so that we can query the whole DynamoDB. Down here we have the actual call to the AWS SDK to query the DynamoDB using the scan method. I had to use scan because typically when you're querying DynamoDB, you do it per item, or a lot of people do. And I needed to get all events. So in order to get all events, you have to query for them. And DynamoDB is not really intended to be like a SQL database where you're going to be getting everything, because that reduces performance. But you can. They give you features that allow that. So scan handles that, and you have to pass in the proper expression in order for scan to work. It's fairly simple, but it took a while to figure this out because I had never done it before. So basically what I'm doing is scanning based on the partition key, and I'm saying any event ID that has an ID of 0 or greater, return it in the request. So that's everything, because all of my IDs are larger than 0. They're all number based and they're all bigger than 0. So it's going to return every record. I mean, this has performance concerns, so I'll have to refactor it at some point. But for now, this is good enough for a prototype. All right. The other before I get to front end, I just wanted to show you a quick, simple Lambda example. All the other functions are similar. They use slightly different parameter objects. So we might, when we do an update, we'll put in all of the fields that we're going to update, all the columns or attributes in a DynamoDB, and then we perform basically the same actions, but we use different methods. So, for example, when you're updating, there's a AWS SDK method called update item. Okay, on to the front end. This is the front end structure, which is a lot more complicated because it's Vue-based and it has a lot of stuff in it. It's not that complicated once you understand it, but it does have a lot of folders. So let's start from the top. Front end, the distribution folder is, so after you've run everything, you can build a distribution that you're going to actually deploy to production. That is where all those files live. The CSS, the JavaScript, the HTML, it all gets put into this folder. Public, this is the main entry into our application. It's the index.html. This is a single page web app, and that is the only HTML page, which we'll go over in a minute. But that's the entry point. It has a favorite icon. Assets are any images or other things that you want to include in the project. I didn't expand it because I only have so much room here, but we want to make sure that we have some pretty looking stuff. Auth, this is, so everything's Node, you can see as it's all index.js's, but auth is the auth0 code, which is for authorization. Okay, components, these are Vue components. We'll talk about those in a minute. Plugins, we're using Vuetify in this project. That's how I'm not creating components from scratch. It's actually all, it's a library that you can just pull in different components and reuse them. Router, we have to route, so this is handling the navigation in the app when we move from page to page. Even though it's a single page web app, this is what handles what shows up on the screen when you click on add event or edit event. Store is where we store, that's the code for storing state information or data. And the views are the obviously the Vue views. The most important thing is app view. This, well, maybe not most important, but app view is where Vue.js, the Vue.js app is created. It's in this file, and that gets injected into the index file. Anyway, we'll go over that in more detail. Main.js has all the JavaScript that initializes this whole project. There's some other configuration files in here that we need to, we only need to edit auth-config and main.js to add our properties in to make the project custom to you. So when you create an authorization for user access, you have to point to your client ID and things like that. So that's all in the project documentation. I'm not going to go over everything here. Okay, so an example of the front-end code. This is index.html. And it's very simple web page. We're pulling in some style sheets. And the important thing to note here is this div where it says ID equals app. This is where where the Vue app actually injects its HTML into the DOM. And that's all we really care about. I mean, we do include the favorite icon here. You could add more stuff in here, but there's no need. It's all done through the app. So, like I mentioned, we're using Vuetify, which is a component library. And so in Vue, one of the concepts is you have components, which, buttons or lists or cards or whatever UI component you want to make, you would put it into a component so you can make it reusable. And that's what I've done in this project. We have a component called event.vue. There's other ones too, but this is the main one. And what I've done is I've created a card, which is one of the components that Vuetify provides. So I have a card. So one of the things I didn't really talk about is the structure of Vue, the concept. Vue files are comprised of template, scripts, and styling elements. And it's just like when you have separate files for HTML, where you have the HTML, which would be the template, and the JavaScript, which would be the script, and the CSS, which would be the style. So they combine it all into one file. In my project, I didn't need to use any styling because Vuetify components already have the styling included. So I didn't have any separate CSS or CSS styling elements in my project. But it is there if you need to add it. And I'm not a front-end developer, really, so that's why I chose this, because I would have spent far more time trying to get the UI looking pretty if I didn't use what I have. So, oops, let me go back. So these are examples of the template and the script. One of the things I wanted to mention about, and which is what's powerful about Vue, is you can, within your components, you can inject data. And that's done, so in the scripting part of the file, you can attach properties, and you have a data object where you can grab data. So what we're doing is I have a props that's pulling in information that I'm using here. These curly braces, which is mustache syntax, if you put those between HTML elements, not actually within the attributes of them, but between the tags, it'll populate that area with the data. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm grabbing an event and I'm saying, put the event date into this div, and then event title into this div. So, and then there's also actions on a card. So this is separate from Vue. Vuetify has created an action for their card. So you can add in actionable items in Vue. So there's a thing called @click, which is when you click on this action, which is called delete. So in the UI, there'll be a delete button. And when they click on it, it'll call this method, delete event, and it will pass in. So this card knows which event it is, and it'll pass that event to the delete event method, which will call the backend and call the delete feature. And we'll use the data from this event to populate the backend call. So components actually get pulled into views, which is what this is doing right here. So this a view is kind of really the P. When you're in a normal HTML or a normal web app, you have HTML pages, right? And you would click and go from one page to another. But since this is a single page web app, the way Vue works is they have views. And a view is kind of like the web page. And so each view that you create, you can create, and there's so many ways to structure things. You can have multiple views on one page, but in general, the idea is you have a view and it's kind of like a page. And what you do is you build out what you show in your view from your components. But you can also still, like we did in the component object, you could still put things right in your view if you want to add objects or elements right into your view page itself, the HTML, or the template part. It has the same syntax, template, scripts, and styling. But the way you pull a component in is this way. You bind it. It's called v-binding. And so you basically, what I'm doing here is I'm binding this page, and I'm looping through. So on this particular page, which is the home view, we're getting the event data, and it's an array of all the events that get pulled back from the Dynamo database, and then we're looping through each event and populating one of those cards that we just looked at in the component file. It's pulling each one in, and then it's going to render it in the DOM. So this little blurb of code, actually, if we have 100 cards, it'll populate 100 cards in the UI. And the way that this stuff gets triggered is through the mounting, or the mounted call. So in the script section, there's a call to mounted, which is Vue's lifecycle. And basically, that's when it's going to render the elements to the DOM. And what it does is it calls out to get whatever method you tell it to call, which in this case is we're calling the update results, which calls get events on the back end and gets us our events. And then what it does is it populates all the HTML from that, and then it renders it in the DOM, and you see it on the page. This is the update result, so you can see what it's actually doing. It checks to make sure that our state is initialized. It gets authorization to make sure that the users because we're authenticating, we're protecting these routes, we have to get a token to pass it into our request. And here's the data that we're passing. Remember that data object I mentioned? We're passing that in there. And that's it. Pretty simple. So the next part is, so I'm kind of going backwards. I started from the bottom up. We created a component. We injected that component into a view that we created. And now we're coming up to the Vue application, which was that app.vue file I talked about. That also has the same structure, template, script, and styling. And we're doing similar to what we did with component. We're injecting the actual view into the app template. And we're doing that via a router. So routing, there's a file called router, or index.js for routing. And it's Vue has a whole website on routing, but it's basically how the app handles navigation. So when this home view is being created, it's created because we're going to the first page of the app. It's the home page of the app. And the router has a mapping that says when you go to the base URL, call the home view. So, and that's how it all got triggered. And that happens in main.js and in here. So we're injecting it in here, and then in this script, I just wanted to point out some of it's just a code example to show the scripting. I deleted a lot of the code, but there is a created event or a created method that creates the app. And also, all this stuff includes the authentication, so that's why you're seeing auth stuff. But yeah. Oh, that was pretty much it. So once you've created that, you're done. Everything renders to the DOM, and that's what the user sees. And then routing, when you click on different links in the app, it just reroutes you to the different pages, and the same process occurs. I just wanted to add a bonus at the end because my project, because we had a review, I mean, we in our project documentation, we had to make it so people can just follow it and get everything done. I didn't put my CloudFormation stuff in there, but CloudFormation allows you to deploy the app with just typing a few commands rather than manually running AWS CLI commands or manually using the console. It's way better. But this is an example, an excerpt from the template.yaml file of a Lambda function and the YAML to build out a YAML function and map routes in the API gateway. That is it. So that's it. Thanks.